It all started when a group of young travelers seeking adventure decided to visit Molokai, one of the less popular islands in Hawaii. Known for its pristine beaches, hidden spots, and laid-back atmosphere, Molokai seemed like the perfect destination for those who wanted to escape the crowds and experience something more tranquil. The island, often overshadowed by its more famous neighbors like Oahu and Maui, promised untouched beauty and a slower pace of life. What most visitors didn't realize, however, was that beneath its scenic exterior, Molokai held a darker, more sinister secret, a past filled with old legends and forbidden rituals, a history few dared to speak of. Among the travelers was a group of 5 friends. Jenna, the adventurer, always looking for the next thrill. Mark, the skeptic who preferred to keep his feet firmly planted in reality. Ava, the quiet one, who always seemed to be in tune with her surroundings. Alex, the joker who lightened the mood no matter the situation. And Sam, the leader of the group, who was always the first to suggest the next daring idea. The 5 had become close over the years, their friendship built on shared experiences and a love for exploring the unknown. They had heard rumors of a mysterious site in the dense jungle of Molokai, a long-abandoned temple, hidden deep in the forest, said to be haunted by spirits of the past. It wasn't the kind of place tourists typically ventured to, not because it was known to be dangerous, but because it was practically off-limits. The locals rarely spoke of it, and when they did, their voices dropped to whispers, as if the very mention of it could summon something dark. There were also the warnings. "Don't go near the temple," they said. "Stay away from the forest," they advised. But as often happens with people looking for adventure, the warnings only served to heighten their curiosity. The group was drawn to the idea of uncovering something no one had seen for decades. They packed their bags, gathered their cameras, and set off on their journey, excitement in the air. The locals, sensing their intentions, watched them quietly as they walked past, some shaking their heads, others muttering in hushed tones. But Jenna, Mark, Ava, Alex, and Sam ignored it. They had come for an adventure, and this was what they would find. The journey through the jungle was far more difficult than they had anticipated. The heat was oppressive, and the air thick with humidity. The once clear trail became overgrown, the trees growing closer together, casting long, dark shadows on the path. The further they went, the more the sounds of the island seemed to fade. Birds and insects that had been so loud at the beginning of their journey now seemed distant, as if the jungle itself had swallowed up every noise. The once bustling sounds of the ocean grew quiet, replaced by the overwhelming silence of the forest. Their conversations grew sparse as they pushed forward, the laughter fading into uncomfortable silence. They had been trekking for hours, and the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. The dense trees seemed to form a canopy above them, blocking out the fading sunlight. Even though they were in the middle of an island paradise, the feeling of isolation and discomfort began to settle over them. Every rustling sound in the leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot set them on edge. But still, they pressed on. After all, they were so close, they had to be. When they finally reached the temple, the The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had imagined. The structure, half swallowed by the jungle, seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. Vines wrapped around its stone walls like the hands of nature, pulling it back into the earth. The stone was dark with age, covered in moss, and crumbling in places. Despite the overgrowth, there was a strange sort of majesty to the temple. Its jagged edges and towering spires gave off an imposing energy. The walls were etched with ancient symbols, but they were faint, nearly erased by the ravages of time. The moment they stepped closer to the temple, something in the air changed. The temperature dropped, and the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the physical weight of the jungle pressing in on them. It was something else. A kind of presence that seemed to grow stronger the closer they got. Jenna, always the bold one, stepped forward first, her hand resting lightly against the cool stone of the temple's entrance. There was a strange pulse, a vibration that seemed to hum from the stones themselves. She paused, looking over her shoulder at the others, but they didn't seem to notice. The group entered the temple, and the air inside was thick with dust. It smelled old, musty, like something had been trapped in here for centuries. The only light came from the beams of sunlight that filtered through cracks in the stone, illuminating parts of the temple in an almost ethereal glow. The floor was uneven, littered with rubble, and the walls were covered with faded carvings, symbols none of them could recognize. But the markings were unsettling. The figures depicted in the carvings had strange, exaggerated faces, their eyes hollow and their mouths wide open in silent screams. It was as if the walls themselves were telling a story, one of pain and suffering, of rituals long forgotten. Despite the discomfort, the group pushed on. They took out their cameras and began snapping pictures, making jokes to break the tension. They didn't truly believe in the curses, in the old legends they'd heard from the locals. It was just a temple, an abandoned relic from the past. They laughed it off as they moved further into the structure, exploring every corner. Jenna found an old, worn stone altar at the back of the temple, its surface covered in dark stains that didn't look like natural decay. Mark, ever the skeptic, joked that it was just dirt, but even he couldn't deny the heavy energy that seemed to radiate from the place. Ava, who had been quiet up until then, seemed to feel the weight of it too. She suggested they leave, that it wasn't worth pushing their luck. But Sam, eager to see everything, urged them to stay just a little longer. They all agreed, though there was a subtle tension in the air, something unspoken but present. That was the last time they would all be together. As the sun set behind the trees, the shadows inside the temple grew longer. The group finally decided it was time to head back. But when they turned to leave, something had changed. The entrance to the temple, once clear and open, now seemed to be shrouded in darkness. The path they had taken was no longer visible. The jungle outside was silent, as though it was holding its breath. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the still air. They tried to turn back, but the entrance had vanished, replaced by thick, impenetrable vines and shadows. In the distance, they heard a noise, a low, deep growl, like an animal in the darkness. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Panic set in, but when they tried to move, they couldn't.
It was as if something was holding them in place, invisible chains tightening around their bodies. One by one, they began to scream, but the screams were cut short, muffled by the thick, oppressive air. And then, silence. The next morning, the jungle seemed unnaturally calm. The temple, once filled with the echoes of their laughter and footsteps, was silent. No one saw the group again. Their disappearance, along with the strange reports of the temple, would remain a mystery. The locals, now more reluctant than ever, would simply say one thing: some things are better left undisturbed.
Days passed, and still, there was no sign of the group of young travelers. The locals on Molokai began to grow anxious. What had started as an innocent disappearance had quickly turned into something far more sinister. The elders of the island, those who had lived through the quiet, unspoken history of Molokai, knew deep down what the young tourists had unknowingly stumbled upon. They had disturbed something old, something dangerous, something that should have been left alone, buried in the dark corners of the island's forgotten past. The temple, long abandoned and shrouded in myth, had a dark secret that the travelers could not have possibly known. And now, that secret was awake. In the small town, whispers began to circulate. No one said much openly, but there was an undeniable unease in the air. People who had known the missing group spoke of the warning signs, their nervous excitement before the trip, the curiosity that led them deeper into the jungle, the way they brushed off the warnings of the locals. The travelers' cheerful energy had soon turned to worry as they ventured toward the temple, and now they were gone. The authorities were called in after several days of no word from the group. A small team of police officers and a few volunteers ventured into the dense jungle, following the trail that the friends had left behind. They quickly found the remains of the travelers' campsite, nestled among the trees just a short distance from the temple. The scene was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the chaos they had expected to find. The fire that had once fueled their camp was now nothing but cold ashes, scattered around a few abandoned backpacks. Their belongings were still there, but there was no sign of the group. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken branches that would suggest they had been attacked or hurriedly dragged away. It was as if they had simply vanished. The officers continued deeper into the jungle, following the trail of broken branches and footprints left behind by the group. But as they ventured further, the footprints led to nothing. The dense underbrush swallowed up the marks, and no more signs of the travelers could be found. No fresh clues, no sign of where they had gone. It was as if they had walked into the trees and disappeared into thin air. The deeper the searchers went, the more it felt as if the jungle itself had claimed them, like it had swallowed them whole, keeping its secrets hidden beneath layers of vines and shadows. A police returned with no answers, only a growing sense of dread that hung over the island like an invisible storm cloud. It wasn't long before the strange happenings began to unfold. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the bushes late at night, faint noises that no one could explain. The locals, already on edge, began to hear whispers in the jungle, soft and indecipherable voices carried on the wind. No one could tell where they were coming from. It wasn't the sound of animals or the usual rustling of the trees. It was something deeper, more unsettling. Those who ventured out into the jungle late at night swore they could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Some claimed to see dark figures lurking near the ruins of the temple, figures that were too far away to identify clearly, but too close to ignore. The figures seemed to shift and move at the edge of vision, just outside the corner of the eye, as though they were aware of being watched, always just a few steps away. The children on the island were the first to speak of what they saw. They would come home from playing in the fields or running around near the jungle, their faces pale and their voices trembling. They spoke of shadowy figures that watched them from the edges of the trees, figures that had no faces, only eyes, dark, empty, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into their souls. They spoke of tall shapes moving among the vines, following them without ever stepping into the open. Soon, the adults began to notice it too. It was subtle at first, cold spots in their homes, a sense of being watched even when no one was there. The atmosphere in the village grew heavier, the air thick with an unnatural weight. The weather seemed to change. The once warm breeze of Molokai was now chilled, carrying an unsettling smell, an earthy, musty scent that clung to the air like decay. It was as the island itself was changing, transforming into something darker, something that had been waiting for this moment. But it wasn't just the strange occurrences that rattled the people of Molokai. It was the nightmares. People who had never been near the temple, who had never seen the missing group, began to experience the same haunting dreams. They would wake up in a cold sweat, their hearts racing, feeling as if they had been transported into another world, a world of shadows and whispers. In these dreams, they saw the faces of the 5 travelers, but they weren't the same. The faces were twisted, their once bright and cheerful expressions now gaunt and pale, their eyes hollowed out, as though their very souls had been sucked from them. They were trapped, screaming for help, but their voices were muffled, smothered by a deep, resonating chant. The chant seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the very air itself. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like a prayer or a summoning, spoken in a language no one could understand. The shadows in the dreams would shift and move, surrounding the travelers, holding them in place, while figures, dark and indistinct, stood in a circle, holding candles that flickered with an unnatural, sickly light. As the nightmares continued, more and more people began to talk about them. The whispers spread like wildfire, growing in intensity. People who had no connection to the missing group were having the same dreams, experiencing the same terrifying visions. It felt like the curse was spreading, infecting everyone it touched. The island, once a peaceful haven for those who sought solace, had become a place of fear and dread. The island's cursed past, long buried and forgotten by most, had come back to claim what it was owed. The ritual that had once been sealed away in the depths of the jungle had been reawakened, and now it was hungry. The whispers, the figures, the nightmares, they were only the beginning. Whatever had been disturbed in the heart of the jungle had begun to stir once more, and it wouldn't rest until it had claimed what it sought. Molokai was no longer just an island of beauty and tranquility. It had become a place of terror, and those who lived there now understood. Once the curse was awakened, there was no escaping it. And as the days passed, the people of Molokai realized that the island's darkest secrets had finally come to the surface, and there was no turning back. The nightmares continued to torment the islanders, their waking lives becoming indistinguishable from the terror they faced in their sleep. The once peaceful community of Molokai was now plagued by unease, as fear gripped the hearts of everyone, young and old. The faint whispers that had begun as mere rumors among the locals had grown louder, more urgent. No one was spared from the haunting visions. Each night, people saw the twisted forms of the missing travelers. Their eyes hollow and their bodies decayed, trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. It wasn't just the presence of the lost souls that terrified the island. It was the relentless feeling that something much darker had been unleashed. Keone, an elderly man who had lived in a small, remote village on the island for most of his life, could no longer sit in silence. He had seen the changes in the air, felt the shift in the atmosphere, and knew that the time had come for the truth to be spoken. The truth of the island's past, a past long buried and forgotten by the new generations, had finally resurfaced. It wasn't that Keone hadn't known about the dark history of Molokai. It had been passed down to him by his elders, whispered in hushed voices during the long nights. The ritual, once thought to be a myth, was real, and its consequences were far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Keone had grown up hearing tales of the ancient Hawaiian priests and shamans, wise men and women who had once commanded the forces of nature, able to control the winds, the sea, and even the very land beneath their feet. But their power came at a great cost. To maintain their control over the natural world, they had to appease the spirits of the land, spirits that thrived on fear, pain, and suffering. The priests and shamans performed rituals, sacrifices to these spirits, offerings of human souls to ensure that the balance between the earthly world and the spirit world remained intact. It was said that these spirits could bring prosperity, wealth, and strength to those who honored them, but those who dared to defy them would pay a price, one far steeper than anyone could imagine. For centuries, these rituals were carried out in secret, hidden from outsiders, and only those who truly understood the depth of the island's spiritual traditions were aware of their existence. The islanders had learned to live with the knowledge of these dark practices, respecting the boundaries that had been set in place to keep the spirits at bay. But as with all forbidden things, the temptation to explore the unknown had eventually become too great. Keone remembered the day his elders had spoken of the ritual's final destruction. It was a time long ago when the island's rulers had discovered the true extent of the horrors the ritual had unleashed. They had witnessed the rise of these spirits, creatures born from the darkest depths of the earth, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, their forms twisted and grotesque. In a desperate attempt to stop the madness, the island's leaders had ordered the destruction of the sacred temple where the ritual had been performed. The altar was smashed, the ancient symbols erased from the stones, and the knowledge of the ritual was buried deep beneath the island's surface, never to be spoken of again. Or so they thought. But now, the ritual had been disturbed. Keone had felt it in the air when the travelers arrived, their curiosity burning like a flame that couldn't be quenched. Their innocent exploration had awakened something that had been lying dormant for centuries. It wasn't just the physical temple that had been disturbed. It was the very fabric of the island's spiritual defenses. By stepping into that sacred place, the travelers had unknowingly invited the spirits back into the world, giving them the power they needed to rise once more. Keone knew what had happened to the 5 young travelers. They hadn't simply vanished. They had become part of the ritual itself. Their souls had been trapped in the temple, sacrificed to the dark spirits that dwelled there. The ritual had claimed them, feeding the spirits with the very essence of life itself. Their pain and suffering had strengthened the spirits, making them more powerful, more insistent. And now, these spirits were hungry. They needed more souls to continue their existence. The islanders had been warned. Keone had seen it all unfold before his eyes, the signs that had been present long before the travelers had set foot on Molokai. The whispers in the jungle, the shadows that lingered at the edges of vision, the growing sense of dread that hung in the air like a storm on the horizon. But no one had listened. They had ignored the ancient warnings, believing them to be nothing more than stories told to frighten children. But now, the island was paying the price for that ignorance. The spirits were growing stronger with each passing day. They had fed on the souls of the travelers, but they would not stop there. The longer the ritual continued, the more powerful they would become. Keone knew that the spirits' hunger would soon become unbearable, and they would begin to seek out new victims, new souls to devour. And the island's residents, unaware of the danger they were in, would become their next targets. The first signs had already appeared. The restless whispers in the jungle, the strange figures seen moving just outside the village, the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting. The islanders could sense it. They knew something was wrong. But the truth of what was happening was too terrifying to believe. Keone had spent his life hearing the old legends, but he never imagined that he would live to see them come to life. The spirits were not just stories. They were real, and they were here. Keone decided that it was time to speak, to warn the others before it was too late. The elders had always told him that the curse of Molokai was a burden that could never be lifted, that it would one day resurface when the time was right. He had believed them, until now. Now he understood that the island's darkest secret had not been buried forever. It had simply been waiting, and it had been awakened by the curiosity of a few young travelers. With a heavy heart, Keone gathered the villagers, standing in the center of the small community, his voice trembling with the weight of the truth he had kept silent for so long. He explained the history of the island, the rituals, the spirits, and the curse that had never truly been broken. He warned them that the travelers' disappearance was not just a mystery. It was the beginning of something much worse. As he spoke, Keone could see the fear in the eyes of those listening, their faces paling as they realized the true horror of what had been unleashed. Some began to whisper among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief, while others stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. But Keone knew that the time for denial was over. The spirits were here, and they were hungry, and the island's only hope for survival
was to stop the ritual before it claimed them all.
But as he finished speaking, Keone couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The shadows had already begun to move, and the island was already lost. The curse of Molokai had returned, and there was no escaping it. The spirits would feed, and the island would be their feast. As the days wore on, the island of Molokai began to change in ways that the locals could neither explain nor understand. The once vibrant landscape, with its clear, blue skies and sparkling waters, slowly began to darken. The sun, which had always bathed the island in warmth and light, seemed to be swallowed by an ever-growing layer of thick, black clouds that hung heavy in the sky. No matter the time of day, the sun never fully emerged, and the skies remained a constant gray, casting a melancholic pallor over the island. The air, once fresh and filled with the scent of salt and flowers, now carried a strange heaviness, as if the island itself was breathing in a way that was unnatural. The winds, which had always been gentle and soothing, grew colder with each passing day. The familiar trade winds that once rustled the palm trees and created soft ripples on the surface of the ocean now carried a biting chill. The air became oppressive, thick with an energy that seemed to press down on the island like a heavy weight. The waves that once lapped gently against the shore began to crash violently against the rocks, sending sprays of foam high into the air. The normally serene beaches were now treacherous, and no one dared to swim in the ocean, as the currents grew unpredictable and dangerous. The jungle, which had always been welcoming, with its dense canopy and lively creatures, began to feel suffocating. The trees seemed to groan in the wind, their branches creaking as if they were protesting some unseen force. The wildlife that had once populated the forest was suddenly gone, leaving the jungle eerily quiet. Birds that once sang in the morning were no longer heard, and the rustling of animals in the underbrush had stopped. The forest had become a dead place, its heart still and silent. It was on one of these nights, when the winds howled louder than usual, that the villagers first heard it, the chanting. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur carried by the wind. It sounded far away, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. As the night wore on, the sound grew louder, its eerie cadence rising and falling like a wave crashing against the shore. It was a low, rhythmic sound, an ancient chant that no one on the island had ever heard before. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if it came from deep within the earth itself. By the time the villagers had gathered in the town square, the chanting had grown so loud that it seemed to be coming from all directions. The very air was charged with a strange, palpable energy, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble in time with the chant. The moon, obscured by the thick clouds above, cast an eerie, ghostly glow over the island. The villagers huddled together, their faces pale with fear, as they realized that what they had been dreading was happening. The ritual, the dark force that had been unleashed all those days ago, had begun again. The first figures appeared at the edge of the jungle, just beyond the tree line. At first, they were mere shadows, indistinct and barely visible. But as the chanting grew louder, they became more defined. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. The villagers could barely make out their forms, but there was no mistaking the feeling they gave off. Something ancient, something malevolent, standing just beyond the light. The figures did not move. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable in the thick, oppressive air. They knew what these figures were. They were the spirits, ancient, restless spirits, the very beings that had been summoned by the ritual. They had fed on the souls of the travelers, and now their hunger had returned. They needed more. The spirits had never been meant to roam the earth again, but now they were here, and they were growing stronger with every passing moment. Night after night, the figures appeared, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness, their silent presence growing more and more terrifying. The chanting did not stop. In fact, it grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the trees, from the very ground itself, and the villagers could feel it deep within their bones. The island was alive with the spirits' hunger, and it was only a matter of time before they would begin to claim more souls. The villagers gathered in the town square every night, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They spoke in hushed tones, but the fear in their eyes said more than words ever could. Some had seen the figures up close, had felt the unnatural chill that accompanied them. Others had heard the voices in the wind, faint whispers that seemed to call their names, pulling them toward the jungle. The villagers knew what was coming, but they didn't know how to stop it. Keone's warnings echoed in their minds, but what could they do? The ritual had already been set in motion, and now it seemed unstoppable. Each night, the figures came closer, moving out of the shadows and into the village, their hollow eyes scanning the frightened faces of the villagers. The sound of their chanting grew louder, filling the air with an unbearable tension. The trees seemed to bend with the weight of the spirits' presence, their branches swaying despite the stillness of the air. It was as if the very earth itself was in the grip of something ancient, something evil. One night, as the chanting reached its peak, something changed. The wind picked up, howling through the jungle, and the villagers felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. The figures, which had once remained still, now began to move. They drifted forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were being drawn toward something or someone. The villagers recoiled, fear tightening their chests as the spirits moved closer, their eyes glowing brighter, their forms more defined in the dim light. It was then that the first soul was claimed. A young woman named Lanny, who had been standing near the edge of the village, suddenly collapsed, her body jerking violently, as if she were being pulled by an invisible force. Her screams, muffled by the chanting, echoed through the village as the figures surrounded her. In the blink of an eye, she was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just an empty space where she had stood moments before. The villagers were paralyzed, unable to move or speak. They had witnessed the spirits claim their first victim, and they knew, deep down, that it would not end with Lanny. The shadows were growing stronger. They had tasted blood, and now they would not stop. The spirits were restless, hungry for more, and the villagers, trapped on their cursed island, had no idea how to stop them. Every night, more figures appeared, and the chanting grew louder, an unrelenting reminder that the ritual had begun again. The island of Molokai had become a place of nightmares, a place where shadows moved in the night, waiting to claim more souls. And with each passing night, the island grew darker, the air heavier, as the spirits closed in, ready to feast. Emily stepped off the boat and onto the shore of Molokai with a heavy heart. She had been frantic when she first heard about her sister Jenna's disappearance. The moment she found out that Jenna and her friends had vanished into the jungle, she knew something was terribly wrong. Emily had been hoping for a simple explanation, maybe just a little adventure gone wrong. But now, she felt it deep in her bones that this was far beyond what she had imagined. The island she had read about in books, the one known for its peaceful beaches and scenic beauty, had transformed into something dark and suffocating. The air, thick with a heavy humidity that she couldn't seem to shake, felt oppressive as soon as she stepped onto the dock. The usually welcoming locals were now silent, their faces full of dread. The streets, normally lively with people going about their day, were eerily empty. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that rustled the trees. It was as if the life had been drained from the island, leaving behind a haunting emptiness. Emily's heart ached as she walked through the small village, her eyes scanning the faces of the few villagers who dared to peek out of their homes. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the looks she received were filled with fear. It seemed that no one dared to speak freely about the strange events that had begun to plague Molokai. She couldn't help but feel that they knew something they weren't telling her. In the village square, she found Keone, the old man who had lived on the island for as long as anyone could remember. He was the one person who seemed to know about the island's dark past, the one who could understand the terrifying whispers that were being spread among the locals. His face was lined with age and worry, and his eyes, though old and tired, seemed to hold the weight of the island's secrets. When Emily approached him, he looked at her gravely, as if he had been expecting her. "You're looking for your sister," he said, his voice low and rough. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Emily nodded, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. "I need to know what happened. I need to find out where she is. Please, you have to help me," Emily pleaded, her voice breaking. Keone stared at her for a long moment, and then, with a sigh, he motioned for her to follow. He didn't need to say much. Emily could see the sadness in his eyes, a sadness that only deepened as he led her toward the edge of the village, toward the dense jungle where the ancient temple stood, where her sister and her friends had last been seen. The journey was long and unsettling. The trees grew thicker as they ventured into the heart of the island, and the familiar sounds of the jungle, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, had grown eerily absent. The closer they got to the temple, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the very land was burdened with the weight of something unspeakable. Emily felt her skin prickle, and she instinctively pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Though she knew it wasn't the cold she was feeling, it was fear. Fear that something was waiting for her, something that would reveal the truth about her sister's disappearance, but would also drag her deeper into the island's dark past. When they finally reached the temple, The sight was far worse than Emily had imagined. The temple's ruins were half swallowed by the jungle, its once majestic stones now cracked and weathered with time. The air was thick, heavy, with an unnatural stillness that seemed to make the jungle feel suffocating. The temple, once forgotten, now seemed alive, its very presence watching them, waiting. Emily felt a chill creep down her spine, and she looked to Keone for some sort of reassurance, but he didn't meet her eyes. He seemed to be preparing himself for something, his face drawn with resignation. "This is where it began," Keone said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ritual was performed here long ago, but it was stopped. We thought it was buried forever, but they've awakened it." Emily felt a knot twist in her stomach as she looked up at the ruins. Strange symbols, faint but unmistakable, glowed faintly on the stones as if the temple itself was alive, with an energy that pulsed from deep within the earth. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the very earth seeming to tremble with an ancient power that had been dormant for centuries. Keone took a deep breath and nodded toward the entrance. "We have to go inside," he said, his voice grim. "It's too late to stop it now, but we have to try. Your sister's soul is still trapped here." They entered the temple together, and as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The air was colder than before, and Emily's breath came out in visible puffs. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm, sending a jolt of terror through her. She spun around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she tried to shake off the feeling, but the dread was overwhelming. It was as if the temple itself was reaching out to her, trying to pull her in deeper. As they ventured further inside, Emily's mind raced with questions. What had happened to her sister? To Jenna? Where were they? The temple, dark and silent, felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The shadows seemed to shift and move, swirling around them like living things, as if they were being watched from every corner. Suddenly, the walls seemed to tremble. The shadows, once just strange forms at the edges of the room, began to move. Figures emerged from the darkness, figures that were familiar but twisted. They were the missing travelers, Jenna, Mark, Ava, Alex, and Sam. But their faces were wrong. Their skin was pale, ashen, and their eyes were black, hollow, and empty. Their mouths were stretched wide in silent screams that made no sound, only the dreadful presence of their pain. The shadows twisted around the figures, pulling them further into the room, as if they were part of the very darkness itself. The sight was horrifying, and Emily's heart clenched in her chest as she realized that these were not just the lost souls of her friends. They were part of the ritual, trapped in this place, feeding the dark spirits that had been awakened. One by one, the figures turned toward her, their empty eyes locking onto hers. She could feel their pain, their desperation, and it made her skin crawl. They reached out to her, but they were not alive. They were just shadows, echoes of the past, forever trapped in this hellish cycle. The air was thick with their sorrow, and the shadows whispered to her, their voices a cacophony of torment. "Join us," the shadows whispered. "Become one with us. Let your soul feed the spirits. You will be free." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking with fear. She could feel the temptation, the pull to surrender, to end her suffering and join them. But deep down, She knew this was not her fate. She could not let herself become part of this curse. She could not let her sister's sacrifice be in vain. "No," Emily said, her voice trembling but filled with defiance. "I won't join you." At that moment, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and the temple seemed to groan as if it were alive. The very earth beneath her seemed to shift, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the air. The shadows grew stronger, their forms twisting and expanding, reaching out toward her with a force that was both terrifying and powerful. She could feel the weight of their presence pushing against her, pulling her into the darkness. The temple seemed to shake with the power of the ritual, the walls crumbling as the ground split open. The shadows, now thicker and more powerful than ever, began to engulf the room. The once peaceful island had transformed into a living nightmare, a place of torment and darkness, where the spirits of the dead now held sway. The earth groaned beneath her, and with a final scream, the ground swallowed the temple whole. The shadows continued to grow stronger, and the island of Molokai, once a peaceful haven, had turned into a prison for the souls of the damned, forever trapped in the dark rituals of the past. And Emily, standing in the middle of the chaos, realized too late that there was no escape from the island's curse. The ritual had claimed its final victim, and now the island would burn in darkness forever. The island of Molokai was never the same after that night. The once vibrant paradise, where the sun kissed the beaches and the ocean shimmered with the promise of serenity, had turned into something far darker. The lush green jungles, which had once echoed with the sounds of birds and life, were now silent and oppressive. The air, once fresh and full of the scents of tropical flowers, was now thick and heavy with a dark energy that weighed on the hearts of those who remained. The skies above Molokai had never fully cleared since the night the ritual was disturbed. The sun no longer shone with its old brilliance, and the moon had a dull, pale glow, as if even the heavens were afraid to look upon the island. The villagers who had survived the horrors of the ritual and the spirits that had been unleashed were forever changed. Their eyes had seen things no one should ever witness. They had felt the presence of the spirits in the shadows, and they had heard the chilling chant that echoed from the ruins of the temple. Though they tried to move on with their lives, something in them had been lost. They couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness still lingered, that the island itself was watching them, waiting for something to happen. They had seen the missing travelers become part of the ritual, their souls swallowed by the temple. But they knew the worst was yet to come. The 5 friends, Jenna, Mark, Ava, Alex, and Sam, had never been found. Despite the search efforts and the passing of years, there were no remains, no trace of their bodies, only the abandoned campsite and the eerie quiet of the jungle. It was as if they had been erased from the world, leaving nothing but their absence in the place where they once stood. But the villagers knew the truth. Those 5 souls were now part of something far greater, trapped in the dark ritual that had claimed them. They had been sacrificed to feed the spirits that roamed the island, their energy forever bound to the temple that had summoned them. No one dared to visit Molokai again. It was as if the island had become a place forgotten by time, a place that had become too cursed to even acknowledge. The outside world had moved on, but Molokai was forever trapped in a nightmare. The memories of those who had perished there seemed to fade, but the dark energy that hung over the island remained as a constant reminder. The whispers of the ritual, the faint chanting carried on the wind, were heard by the few brave enough to live on the outskirts of the village. Every so often, late at night, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, people would hear the faint sound of chanting, like a distant song, too quiet to understand, but too present to ignore. The air would grow still, and the hairs on the back of their necks would rise. It was the sound of the spirits, hungry and restless, always calling for more. Though the ritual had been interrupted, it had never truly been stopped. It had merely been delayed. The spirits of Molokai were not easily quenched. They had fed on the souls of the travelers, but they needed more. The hunger that had been awakened within them had not been satisfied by the 5 souls offered to them. It was only a matter of time before they would begin to stir again, seeking out new victims to feed their endless thirst for power and strength. As the years passed, the island seemed to grow darker. The once serene landscape had become a place of nightmares. The jungle, which had been a symbol of life and vitality, now felt suffocating. The trees too thick, the shadows too deep. The animals had not returned, and the few remaining villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes constantly darting to the edges of the jungle, afraid of what might be watching from within. The once beautiful beaches, where tourists had once lounged under the sun, were now a ghostly place, abandoned and left to the mercy of the waves. The ocean, that had once been so welcoming, was now violent, the tides erratic and unpredictable, as though the spirits of the island had claimed control of the waters as well. The ritual had set the stage for something even darker. The spirits were no longer confined to the temple. They had begun to spread, seeping into the very land, infecting the island with their malevolent presence. Every tree, every stone, every ripple in the water seemed to carry their mark. The island had become a prison, not just for the souls of the travelers, but for anyone who dared to step foot there. The spirits were always watching, always waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to awaken the curse. The villagers knew that the island was doomed. It was no longer a place of peace, no longer a place where people could live their lives in comfort. Molokai had become a place of eternal darkness, a place where the spirits would always reign. The islanders spoke little of the curse, for fear of attracting the attention of the spirits. But they all knew what the island had become. Some would leave, packing their belongings and leaving the island in search of safer shores. But no one ever spoke of returning. Molokai had become a place of nightmares, a place where the shadows grew stronger every day, waiting for the next victim to stumble into their grasp. And so, the legend of Hawaii's forgotten horror continued. It was a story whispered only in hushed tones, passed down from those who had seen the darkness with their own eyes, those who had witnessed the horrors of the ritual. The travelers, lost to time, had become part of the island's curse, their souls forever entwined with the spirits that walked the land. No one knew when the curse would be broken, or if it ever could be. The darkness was too strong, the ritual too powerful. As long as the spirits still hungered, Molokai would remain a place trapped in hell, where the shadows waited for the next soul to wander into their grasp. Molokai was no longer a place of beauty, no longer a place where one could escape to find peace. It was a place of suffering, a place of eternal torment, where the echoes of the ritual still lingered in the air, carried on the wind. The island had become a hell on earth, and no one who ventured there would ever escape the curse that had taken root. The shadows were always watching, waiting, and Molokai would never be free. The island had become a prison, its gates locked by the ritual that would never be undone.